Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore the remarkable history and astonishing achievements of perhaps the greatest of the Americas' pre-Columbian civilizations, the ancient Maya.
They created one of the ancient world's most stunning civilizations in the very unlikely milieu of a tropical rainforest. And we find it very hard to work out how people without metal, without the wheel, without draft animals, were able to build these colossal temples.
For over 1,000 years, from around the 5th century AD, the ancient Maya prospered in Central America as one of the world's most magnificent civilizations, until the Spanish conquest in the 16th century finally brought their greatness to an end. Unlike other pre-Columbian civilizations, such as the Aztecs and the Inca, the ancient Maya never had a unified empire, but were instead a collection of independent and often warring city-states, spread across a wide area, covering around 600 miles from north to south and 400 miles from east to west. In this episode, we'll travel through time to explore over 1,000 years of ancient Maya history through the extraordinary stories of the greatest Maya cities. Our story starts in the 7th century AD, during the heyday of one of the earliest of the classic Maya's great cities, Palenque, in southern Mexico. Palenque was at its height of splendor during the 7th century AD, when almost all the grand buildings remaining today were constructed, most during the long reign of King Pacal the Great, who ruled over Palenque from 615 to 683 AD. As well as being one of the earliest great Maya cities, Palenque's history has been known about for longer than almost any other Maya city, since it was amongst the first to be investigated by archaeologists during the 18th and 19th centuries. The building being excavated here in the 1890s, the so-called palace, appears to have been one of Palenque's most important buildings.
All the public things were concentrating here. It's like a sort of parliament. Probably the ruler came here with all his members of the palace, taking decisions about the city, about the reign. It's the place that represents the power, the exclusivity of the elite people here at Palenque.
At the center of the palace, a large courtyard is decorated with images of humiliated prisoners of war who were captured during attacks on other cities and who were almost certainly brought here to be ritually sacrificed. Elsewhere on the palace walls, sculpted stucco images depict the mighty rulers of Palenque, elaborately dressed in the regalia usually worn by gods.
We can see this in all the attributes they are wearing in the clothes, in the headdress. No, we have a representation of the god of the sun, the god of the rain, the god of the agriculture, a wheel. So it's a way to say we are the representatives of the gods here at the level of the earth.
Remarkably, Although these stucco images have been exposed to the elements for more than 1,300 years, some small traces still remain of the bright colors that were originally used. In fact, not only were these stucco images once painted, but here at Palenque and throughout the Maya world, all the great Maya buildings as we see them today would originally have looked very different.
There was a marvelous woman called Merle Green Robertson who spent 40 years working at Palenque, and she was able to show that towards the end of the city's life, almost all of its public buildings were painted in red, almost certainly from ground up hematite, that is iron oxide lumps from within the limestone.
Temples like this one, the Temple of the Sun, were not only painted red from top to bottom, they were brightly decorated with other colors too. Built right at the end of the 7th century AD, it's notable in particular for its highly elaborate roof comb, which effectively acted as a giant billboard to vividly advertise the ruler of Palenque and his closeness to the gods. As on almost all Maya buildings, their most sacred color, a unique pigment known as Maya blue, was used only for the rulers and gods who dwelled in the heavens above. Palenque's most famous temple is the so-called Temple of the Inscriptions. Built during the reign of King Pacal the Great, construction work began in 675 AD, when Pacal was, for his time, a very elderly man in his 70s. Until modern times, it was believed that, like other similar Maya buildings, it was simply a temple dedicated to worship of the gods. In the early 1950s, however, a sensational archaeological discovery by Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruth transformed our understanding of the building's significance.
Alberto Ruth discovered a staircase that was going inside the temple, and he discovered Pacal's tomb in 3 seasons, from 1948 to 1952. It is a great moment in not only Mexican archaeology, but in world archaeology, because for the first time, we knew that there were tombs inside these temples.
In order to stop tomb robbers easily reaching King Pacal's tomb hidden inside the temple, however, the ancient Maya had filled in the staircase leading to it with 300 tons of rubble. And this was why it took excavators 3 years of hard work to get all the way down to the tomb. The tomb itself turned out to be the richest and best preserved burial site ever found in the Americas. Beneath the lid of the huge, elaborately carved sarcophagus lay the body of the great King Pacal, clothed in priceless jewelry, including a fabulous jade death mask covering his face. King Pacal's tomb was the first royal tomb ever found intact inside a Maya temple. Since then, however, many other tombs of Maya rulers have been found inside temples, notably at Tikal in Guatemala and Copan in Honduras. Located in modern-day Honduras, Copan in ancient times was a medium-sized frontier city on the extreme southern border of the Maya region, surrounded by non-Maya peoples. With a population estimated at around 20,000, Copan's heyday was in the early 8th century AD, during the rule of a king known as 18 Rabbit. Most of Copan's great buildings, as we see them today, were constructed during his reign. 2 temples built by 18 Rabbit, however, have in recent times been discovered to contain the tombs of previous kings of Copan. This one in particular contains the tomb of Copan's first king, known as Yaxha, who founded the city in the 5th century AD.
This is important because the hieroglyphic texts from 4 centuries later at Copan had talked about this king as the founder. And a lot of archaeologists had said, no, this is simply imaginary. He was essentially a bush league chief, if he existed at all. What we found with the tomb of Yaxha is he really did exist. His dates, his name, his career had all come down to us over 4 centuries, and we know, therefore, that the Maya were telling the truth in their texts.
The tomb of Copan's 12th king, meanwhile, has also been found, buried under the hieroglyphic stairway, Copan's most famous monument. Built by 18 Rabbit, Copan's 13th king, on top of the tomb of his predecessor, it's the longest known Maya hieroglyphic text, with as many as 2,000 recently deciphered glyphs.
This is the biggest piece of propaganda in Copan and one of the biggest in the Maya world. It says the story of the kings of Copan from the founder, Yaxha, to the 15th king, who is the one who finished that hieroglyphic stairway. And the 12th king of Copan is buried under that hieroglyphic stairway. The 12th king of Copan may not have been accepted by everybody in Copan. It may be that the 12th king was not pure Maya, or at least was not considered by the others as a pure Maya. So it is a piece of propaganda to place the 12th king of Copan and his successor within the line of legitimacy of the kings. The 13th king of Copan, the one we call 18 Rabbit, was certainly the greatest king of Copan, but he had to deal with lots of problems. And he's the one who started that propaganda to say, don't worry, everything all right.
For the rest of 18 Rabbit's 40-year-long rule, Copan certainly flourished as never before. But by the end of his reign, deepening conflict with neighboring Maya cities foreshadowed Copan's impending downfall.
There was a conflict with Quirigua. 18 Rabbit was made prisoner by the king of Quirigua, and he was sacrificed in Quirigua. And from his death in 738, that was the beginning of the end of Copan.
There would be 4 more kings of Copan, but the city's glory days would soon be over. Within less than 100 years of 18 Rabbit's death, the great city-state of Copan collapsed soon after 800 AD. Nobody knows for certain why. Possibilities include civil war, overpopulation, severe drought, famine, or disease. But for whatever reason, Copan's abandoned ruins were before long overgrown with jungle, remaining lost to the world for nearly 1,000 years until their eventual rediscovery.
The collapse of classic Maya civilization in general is still one of the great debated mysteries. There are as many theories as there are Maya archaeologists. There could have been a population continuing to live there for decades after the last record we have of a royal presence. So I think while the history may be cut off, the Maya themselves have always endured. And exactly why the civilization was truncated at the top, why its head was cut off, is something we're still arguing about.
Not only Copan, but many other great Maya cities mysteriously collapsed around the 9th century AD, which intriguingly was just after they'd reached their greatest power and splendor. Perhaps the most magnificent of all these doomed cities was Pacal in modern Guatemala. Much larger and more powerful than its subordinate ally Copan, Pacal had been an important city for centuries before Copan's rise to prominence. But Tikal's era of greatest magnificence was also in the 8th century AD. Just 4 years before 18 rabbits' capture and ritual sacrifice in 738 AD, Tikal's greatest king, Asal Chan Kawil, met a much happier end, buried amidst great pomp and ceremony beneath Tikal's most famous temple, known as Temple 1. The tomb was in fact built first, with the towering 150-foot-high temple then built above it. In the shrine at the top, closest to heaven, Maya priests performed sacred rituals in honor of the dead king. Below it, the temple rises in 9 great steps, symbolizing the 9 levels of the Maya underworld. Buried beneath all of it was the king's splendid tomb, discovered by archaeologists in 1962 via a tunnel cut into the foot of the main stairway. Apart from Temple 1, there are 5 other huge temple pyramids at Tikal, as well as thousands of other smaller buildings. The magnificent Temple 2, for example, opposite Temple 1 across Tikal's main plaza, was dedicated in honor of King Hasal Chang Kawil's wife. Spread out across the vast ancient city of Tikal, the spectacular roof combs of Tikal's many great temples, all built within around 100 years of each other, today tower majestically above the rainforest canopy. Until the modern rediscovery of the lost city of Tikal in the mid-19th century, however, all of these great temples had been concealed beneath the jungle overgrowth for around 1,000 years, since the mysterious collapse of Tikal and many other great ancient Maya cities around 900 AD. These remarkable photographs of Tikal were taken in the 1880s by British archaeologist Alfred Maudsley, who, helped by a huge team of workers chopping down the jungle, was the first to clear the site so that the great ancient monuments of Tikal could be properly studied.
Alfred Maudsley, it is practically the beginning of Maya archaeology here at Tikal. There are almost 3,000 archaeological structures identified as part of the main area of the ancient city of Tikal. For sure, for Guatemala, it's the biggest archaeological site, considered key in the history of Maya civilization. The amount of people concentrated here in late classic times, it is estimated about 70,000, probably more. There were traders, there were warriors, there were peasants, there were different kinds of artisans working for the elite. The Maya managed to be here for more than 1,200 years. So that's an indication of how successful they were.
Given the extraordinary length of time that civilization flourished in Tikal, it's all the more mysterious that the end, when it came, was so sudden. Hidden beneath the enveloping jungle, the still mostly unexcavated Temple 3 was the last great building constructed at Tikal in 810 AD. Towering 180 feet high, the magnificent temple's roof comb once proudly proclaimed the supremacy of the ruler who created it. Almost as soon as the temple was built, however, the power of the great city of Tikal began to crumble around it. Soon abandoned, within just a few decades, the deserted city of Tikal began to be swallowed up by the jungle.
The abandonment was not an event that happened in just at Tikal. It was an event happening in many other cities. Several years ago, the archaeologists and anthropologists were trying to explain the Maya collapse by using just one cause: earthquake, diseases, wars. But now, according to archaeological evidence, but also epigraphical evidence and another source of evidence, now we can understand the event of the collapse to be a combination of several factors.
It's generally thought, however, that the most important of the multiple causes of the Maya collapse was environmental.
What we can say is that we now know there were more Maya than ever before, living in more cities than ever before, more closely packed into the landscape than ever before, so there was immense stress placed upon the environment and upon the economic system. And my suspicion is that there was a tipping point, and the tipping point may well have been a series of droughts in the late 8th and early 9th century, which simply rendered some of these cities no longer inhabitable at the level of density and complexity that they had achieved.
A major cause of the great droughts, it appears, was deforestation. Vast areas of forest were cleared to grow food for the huge populations of Tikal and other cities, and also to provide firewood and building materials. In the end, it seems, the Maya of the great cities of Tikal, Copan, and Palenque may have been victims of their own success, their grandiose ambitions no longer able to be supported by the environment. Interestingly, however, the classic Maya collapse in the 9th century AD generally only affected cities in the southern and central Maya regions. Northern Maya cities in the Yucatan in modern-day Mexico were able to survive a little longer. For example, the beautiful city of Uxmal. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, Uxmal is one of the best preserved of all ancient Maya cities, partly due to the very high quality of stone and building techniques used, and also because of the region's dry climate. Dominating the region during its heyday in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, with a population of around 30,000, Uxmal is renowned for the distinctive architectural style of its magnificent temples and palaces. The so-called Governor's Palace, for example, over 300 feet long and 50 feet wide, typifies the elaborate style, with a mosaic of repeated geometric patterns along its facade, interspersed with vivid masks of Maya gods.
It's decorated with the longest continuous frieze of mosaic stonework in the Maya area. We don't actually know what it was used for, although it's the most obvious candidate to be the royal palace of the kings of Uxmal.
Raised up on a large platform in order to dominate the city, remarkably, it's estimated that 500,000 tons of earth and rocks had to be moved in order to create the base on which the governor's palace stands. The most famous of Uxmal's buildings, however, is the so-called Temple of the Magician. Standing well over 100 feet high and unusually oval-shaped, it has legendary significance even for modern Maya people, as the director of Uxmal explains.
Es una gran satisfacción para mí trabajar en Uxmal, primero porque soy heredero de esta cultura, soy maya. Los que habitaron y construyeron aquí fueron nuestros ancestros. Lo del adivino está relacionado con una leyenda que ha permanecido de manera oral de generación en generación hasta nuestros días. En la ciudad vivía una vieja hechicera que pues tuvo un hijo, un enano muy inteligente, y el enano asume el poder de Uxmal. Mandó a construir el templo del adivino en una sola noche. Y obviamente el templo del adivino, pues, se construyó en un largo periodo de tiempo. La base del templo es del año 400 a.C. Y bueno, y tenemos periodos, otras subestructuras que se construyeron en el año 600, en el año 810 después de Cristo. Y bueno, y la última fase que es el año 950 después de Cristo. Pues es un edificio que se construyó durante un muy largo periodo de tiempo.
Throughout the 4 centuries when the city flourished, one god above all others was especially venerated in Uxmal, Chark, the god of rain. His image is seen repeatedly on all of Uxmal's great buildings, including the Temple of the Magician.
El mascarón de Chark es una cara con sus cejas, con un tocado, con los ojos muy bien marcados, la nariz, la boca y las orejeras y los aretes que cuelgan en los laterales del mascarón. Los mayas de Uxmal veneraban al dios de la lluvia, porque de él dependían la vida de los gobernantes y del pueblo.
Uxmal completely depended on rainwater, since there are no rivers, lakes, or permanent water holes near the city. Unfortunately for the inhabitants of Uxmal, however, their worship of the rain god Chark wasn't enough to keep the rainfall flowing. Scientific evidence shows that a major drought occurred at the end of the 10th century AD, and as a result, it seems, the city was abandoned. Despite the collapse of the great Maya cities of Palenque, Copan, Tikal, and Uxmal by the end of the 10th century AD, there was, however, still one magnificent Maya city whose greatest days were yet to come. One of the most famous and spectacular of all Maya cities, Chichen Itza. Throughout much of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries AD, Chichen Itza was the largest and most powerful remaining Maya city, with a population of as many as 50,000 people. The city's many spectacular ceremonial buildings are spread over a large area of over 2 square miles. But the most famous is located right at the center of the city, the temple of the feathered serpent Kukulkan, popularly known as El Castillo, the castle.
El castillo es uno de los monumentos más importantes del sitio porque representa el centro del universo para el mundo maya. Es el lugar donde confluyen las energías del inframundo y del mundo celeste en el plano de los hombres. Kukulkan es el dios más importante en la cosmovisión maya. Según los mitos, Kukulkan baja al inframundo y ahí le roba a las hormigas el maíz blanco y amarillo con el cual va a hacer una pasta y de la cual va a formar al ser humano. También en su viaje al inframundo trae los huesos de los antepasados, trae el tiempo y por ello el calendario. Entonces podríamos decir que el castillo es un monumento dedicado al tiempo, al cosmos.
Like almost all ancient cultures, the Maya depended above all else on successful agriculture to sustain their civilization. And consequently, it was of vital importance to be able to accurately calculate the annual seasons.
Por ello es que llevaban un cómputo muy exacto de los ciclos solares, de la luna, de Venus y de algunos otros astros en el cielo.
Raised up on 9 platforms representing the 9 levels of the Maya underworld, the temple on top of El Castillo was where the observations of the sun and other heavenly bodies were made. Symbolically, it's significant that each of the 4 stairways up to the temple has 91 steps. 91 multiplied by 4 is 364, and by adding 1 for the final step or platform on which the temple stands, you get 365, the number of days of the solar year.
En el caso del castillo, sus orientaciones astronómicas permiten registrar equinoccios y solsticios. Sin embargo, para tener una mayor precisión construyeron el famoso observatorio o caracol, en el cual se registran de una manera más precisa los pasos equinocciales y solsticiales.
Raised on a high square platform, the uniquely circular El Caracol Observatory is thought to date back to around 900 AD. According to the astronomical observations made at El Caracol, it's believed that Chichen Itza's priests and rulers decreed the times for crop planting and harvesting, as well as for important annual ceremonies. The observations seem to have been made through a series of small windows aligned with significant astronomical events. This window lined up with the setting of the moon on the spring equinox. When it was the summer solstice, on the other hand, the sun set at the far right-hand side of this window. And when the sun set at the far left-hand side of the window, it was once again the spring or autumn equinox. For their era, the Maya were certainly great astronomers, able to precisely identify the changing of the seasons. But there was another, much darker side to their determination to do all they could to ensure good harvests. Looking out from above each of the observatory's main doorways are masks of the rain god Chark, on whose whims successful agriculture also depended. In order to encourage Chark to keep the rain flowing and avert disastrous droughts, Maya priests carried out numerous grisly human sacrifices. Many of the victims were thrown into this so-called well of sacrifice.
Los investigadores, arqueólogos han encontrado sacrificios humanos. Se había supuesto que solamente eran doncellas, pero los restos óseos nos hablan de que había hombres, mujeres, niños, ancianos de todas las edades, no necesariamente doncellas vírgenes.
As well as these human sacrifices intended to avoid drought, it's thought the Maya sacrificed many other people in order to keep the sun up in the sky. One of the Maya's big fears was that the sun wouldn't come up in the morning, having been taken prisoner in the night by the underworld. It was in order to avoid this, it's believed, that the so-called Maya ball game was played. A sacred ritual rather than just a game, it was played in ball courts found in almost all Maya cities, such as this one in Uxmal, and this one at Copan. Maya ball courts were designed in a variety of shapes and sizes, but the famous Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza is by far the biggest of them all. The rules of the game are uncertain, but evidence suggests it was played with a large rubber ball by 2 teams of players, who lined up in separate halves of the ball court, divided by the rings in the middle, symbolizing the center of the universe.
La pelota representaba al sol y era golpeada por los jugadores y el sol viajaba de un extremo del universo al otro. Al final del juego había un sacrificio, lo que aún no sabemos con certeza si eran los ganadores o los perdedores los cuales eran sacrificados. Posiblemente el que era sacrificado era el ganador, porque era un privilegio ir a morar con los dioses en ese paraíso prometido. En los paneles del juego de pelota podemos observar cómo hay dos grupos de guerreros con un capitán ha decapitado al capitán del equipo contrario y se le ve portando la cabeza y el cuchillo con el cual ha sacrificado al capitán del equipo contrario. Y ese capitán sale en chorros de sangre en forma de serpiente.
How extremely bloody the human sacrifices after the ball game could be is indicated by the so-called platform of the skulls, located right beside the great ball court. Here, Maya priests are thought to have placed the severed heads, not just of sacrificed ball players, but of numerous captives and prisoners of war who might be sacrificed at the same time.
Decapitation was one means of sacrifice, and then we know that another one was removing the heart, with the victim bent backwards over an altar so that the knife cut in just below the rib cage, and the priest was able to reach into the chest cavity and using a sharp knife to saw through the blood vessels and remove the heart. Heart removal and head removal were essentially a way of communicating with the gods by offering blood.
Apparently satisfied by the offerings of the sacrificial victim's blood, the Maya gods continued to keep the sun up in the sky, shining on the might of Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza was strong and powerful for a couple of centuries or so, but by the early 13th century, it was in terminal decline, soon to be abandoned like the great classic cities of Palenque, Copan, Tikal, and Uxmal before it. The greatest days of the ancient Maya were now over, 300 years or so before the Spanish conquest finally sealed the fate of the few Maya cities that did remain. One of the few Maya cities that was still flourishing when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century was Tulum, on the Caribbean coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Built on the coast overlooking the Caribbean Sea, the ancient port of Tulum was one of the last cities built by the Maya, flourishing from the 13th century onwards. With a small population of just a few thousand, it was a merchant city, prospering entirely on the profits of coastal trade.
It was one of a string of ports that existed all the way down the coast, which were the hubs of the international canoe trade that at the time of Columbus's voyage, we know reached all the way down to where the Panama Canal is now.
It was a very intense commerce: golds, cotton, shells, obsidian, turquoise, green stone, ceramics, all kind of merchandises floated from this coast. And they used canoes that were made from one piece of wood or a tree. And the Spaniards that arrived in the 16th century mentioned that these canoes were used by at least 25 people on board. We are surrounded by the second biggest coral reef in the world, which is the Mesoamerican coral reef. But there are breaks on the corals, and some archaeologists believe that the castle of Tulum also functions as a lighthouse because it has these two little windows, and if you start a fire inside, the sailors will see these little two red dots from the sea, so they could align their canoes in order to catch in a proper way the break of the coral reef and enter safely.
As it turned out, the big coral reef off the coast may have initially helped to protect the city when the Spanish first arrived in the 16th century. The conquistador Juan de Grijalva, one of the first to discover Mexico, sailed a fleet of 4 ships along the coast here in 1518. But despite apparently sighting Tulum, he continued sailing on by. It's believed likely he thought it too risky to take his ships into shore once he saw the waves breaking over the jagged coral reef.
Exactly in this coast, they passed with their ship and saw the city alive. They describe it as painted in white and very active, and they compare the city with Seville of that time.
Although Tulum escaped the Spanish conquistadors for now, it didn't last long, however. Within decades, the city was abandoned completely, not because of Spanish attack, but most likely as the result of the devastation caused by Old World diseases that arrived with the Spanish, such as smallpox, typhoid, and measles. The Maya had no natural resistance to these diseases, and in some places, up to 90% of the Maya population died. Those Maya who didn't submit to disease could fairly easily be subdued by the gun. And by the mid-16th century, the Spanish were on the verge of conquering almost the entire Maya region, from the Yucatan in the north to the Guatemalan highlands in the south. Today, the best preserved of the ancient Maya cities in the Guatemalan highlands that stood in the way of the Spanish onslaught is Mixco Viejo. Located on top of a high ridge, surrounded by deep ravines, Mixco Viejo was a very new city at the time of the Spanish conquest, founded less than 100 years earlier. Like a number of other Maya cities in the region, it was built in a very easily defended location, since just prior to the Spanish conquest, there was a lot of conflict between different local Maya kingdoms.
But of course, these defensive cities were built for defense against other Maya. They were not built for defense against horses, firearms, or war dogs. And so once there was a determined attack and a determined siege of any of these places, they were going to succumb quite quickly.
In addition to the military superiority of the Spanish, they were also able to speed up the conquest of highland Guatemala by using the age-old tactic of divide and rule, making alliances with one Maya kingdom against another, before later turning on their allies.
That happened in Mexico when they just arrived and they saw it work. And when they came to this land, Guatemala, they used the same tactic. They choose which group will be helpful and they offer them prices for it. In the case of Guatemala, the Quiche were the most powerful by the time, so they allied to the next group around, and then they defeat the Quiches. But soon after, the Spanish didn't do what they offer to their allies, and rebellions began.
The rulers of Mixco Viejo in particular joined forces with the Spanish in 1524 in order to defeat their Quiche enemies, but were so badly treated by the Spanish that they rebelled within just 6 months. Their rebellion was inevitably soon crushed, however, and by the 1550s, almost all the ancient Maya kingdoms in Guatemala and Mexico had been conquered. Remarkably, however, protected by hundreds of miles of surrounding jungle, one last remote stronghold of the ancient Maya remained beyond the reach of the Spanish for another 150 years. The island of Nopeten, on Lake Petanitza, today known as Flores. Nopeten, the modern town of Flores, beautifully located on an island in the middle of Lake Petanitza, was until 1697 the capital of the Yaxha people, the very last unconquered ancient Maya kingdom. Surrounded by a huge area of virtually impenetrable jungle, Nopeten's remoteness allowed it to survive more than a century longer than any other major Maya city.
It really survived by benign neglect until such time as the Spanish decided they ought to do something about what was known to be an independent kingdom, and more to the point, a refuge for dissidents from the Spanish areas up in Yucatan.
After deciding that No Peten's resistance finally had to be crushed, the Spanish constructed a road through the jungle in the 1690s in order to allow an army to advance. In the hope of avoiding the need for battle, however, a number of missionaries first went ahead in order to try to persuade No Peten's proud ruler, King Canek, to convert to Christianity and peacefully submit to Spanish rule.
The Franciscan missionaries arrived to Peten, but he was absolutely loyal to the thoughts, and he doesn't like to hear anything about the Christianity. With that, he rejected the visit. But in a very fury act of the priest, they came up on top of this, like today, island of Flores, and destroyed the idols who was in front of the main temple of the city.
Enraged, King Canek ordered the missionaries to be thrown out of the city. Before long, however, they returned to try one last time to persuade him to convert.
They tried to talk with King Canek, but in the night, King Canek slaughtered all the group. With that, he sent a clear message to the church, the crown of Spain, like he don't want to be under the foot of the Spanish. And with that was the spark to send a large group of people, an army people, in the 13th of March of 1697, and then they come not peacefully in a big war against the people of No Peten and King Canek. And after that, the terribly attack on the 13th of March simply killed many of the Itza people in the island, and that was the end of the Itza civilization, like we call today, in this great island of No Peten. Was a complete tragedy for the Mayan people, you know, after being one of the greatest cultures of the world.
No Peten's ancient Maya temple was demolished following the capture of the city, and in the exact place where it stood, the Catholic Church here was built on top of its ruins, supposedly burying the heathen past forever. Despite the crushing victory of the Spanish conquistadors and their Christian religion, however, centuries later, Maya religious beliefs still endure today amongst the modern descendants of the ancient Maya. At the ruins of Mixco Viejo in the highlands of Guatemala, for example, indigenous Maya people still come to pray at their ancestors' temples.
Culture doesn't disappear from one day to the other. Culture prevails in time. And one example is that this kind of site like Mixco Viejo or others still are living places. People keep coming here to do their prayers in front of their place of origin, the place where they come from. So it's something that is still alive for them.
For archaeologists and historians of the ancient Maya, in fact, the living culture of today's Maya is often a great help in interpreting what would otherwise be a completely vanished world.
Classic Maya civilization has been gone for more than 1,000 years. But the Maya themselves have survived. There are still 6 million of them. They're still speaking 28 Maya languages. Their culture and their language are absolutely vital keys to trying to understand the culture of their ancestors.
Today, all across the region, Maya culture endures, while the spectacular ruins of the ancient Maya are a welcome reminder for today's Maya people that their ancestors once ruled this land and created one of the world's greatest civilizations.